Well, good evening, everyone. As usual, people are still arriving, so it's a couple of minutes after 7, and we'll get started. I want to start tonight with a couple of announcements and a thank you. Thanks to all of you who have written me emails telling me how useful the program has been. That's the second most important return on investment for me. The greatest return on investment will be down the road when I hear from various sources that some of you who have been through the program have become wildly successful and made a lot of money and done some really outstanding things, because I'm convinced that those of you who apply these principles will do so. And especially those of you who have consistently been here, because the evidence of to me, that's evidence that you have the gift of persistence, which, as we've said in a couple of sessions, is one of the hallmarks of being a successful individual. I just did a seminar at NC State University on how to be a highly effective project manager. We had a very small group, 7 people, which is really a nice sized group for a class like that. And 2 people in that class said that it was the best program they'd ever been to, and one of those individuals was 56 years old. And that's very rewarding to an instructor to hear those kinds of comments. Just to give you some feeling for the investment, an hour of online program takes about half a day to a day to develop. So each of these programs has been an investment of nearly a day of time to do it. And I'm very pleased to do that. Also, in a regular classroom environment, the guideline that I try to follow is one from accelerated learning, which is that you spend about 1/3 of your time lecturing, and you have the learners involve the other part of the time in activities that help them develop skills. So these 9 hours will be equivalent to roughly 27 hours of classroom time, which is at 6 hours a day is about almost 5 days of classroom time. So you actually are getting a highly compressed investment here in your own time. And I hope that most of you are trying to find time to actually do the exercises, because that's where your learning takes place. My learning takes place when I develop the programs, because as all of you will know who have done any teaching, you really begin learning when you try to teach this stuff to someone else. And so one of the suggestions I have for you is that you pass this on. Please feel free to refer people to the videos, copy the handouts and give to them so that they've got them if they don't have access to the downloads and so on. But teach these techniques to other people so that you will absorb them yourself. And again, tonight I'm going to be giving you a significant amount of stuff to do in the future, so the session doesn't need to be tremendously long. The work is going to be for you to do when you follow up. So just as a quick review, last week we talked about taking action, and we're going to do more of that tonight. And we talked about how Pleasant Rowland started the Pleasant Company to produce the American Girl doll. We talked about planning and thinking using mind maps, and I'll try to arrange a poll sometime soon to find out how many of you have been doing some of that. And we also talked about creative thinking with Scamper and the PowerThink app. So those were the things we covered last week. Tonight we're going to talk about the rule of 5. We're going to talk about exceeding expectations, keeping score for success, and completing the past. And I was waiting to make sure that most people had arrived, and I think they have. So I need to tell you that I'm traveling next week, and I was in the hotel this past week that I'm going to be in next week, and I tested the online service there, and I had intended to try to do the session next week from the hotel, and I find that the bandwidth is so erratic that I think it would be a total disaster. So I'm going to give you a reprieve next week, and we will have one final session after that, which will be next week's lesson. And then I'm going to record the final lesson the week after that and put it online and send you a notice so that you don't miss a session. So next week there won't be a live session. It will be, we'll skip next week, and then we'll have our final session and then record the one that would have been the final session. So that sounds awfully confusing. So if it's late in the evening and some of you are going a little brain dead like I do at this time of night sometimes, don't sweat it. You'll get notices telling you all about what's going on. Okay, so let's get into the material. And I got a fair amount of the stuff tonight from Jack Canfield's book, The Success Principles. And this is one that he talks about that I really like, and it actually is built into the Total Success app, although not quite to this degree. So, but you can use the Total Success app in the same way. The Rule of 5 says, if you have a specific goal in mind, if you will try every day to think of 5 things that you can do to move toward that goal, you will find that in no time at all you will have achieved it. Now, some examples of this: if you were an author trying to write a book, if you only write 5 pages a day, that means that you can do a 200-page book in about 40 days. And if you look at books, you'll find that typically people like to read generally smaller books with about 200 pages in them. So you could create a book in about that period of time. As a matter of fact, I believe it was the James Bond series that was written that way. The Ian Fleming, I guess it was, who wrote them, would go to an island in the summer, and he would write several pages a day. And he did this very religiously, if you want to use that term, so that every day he wrote, say, 3 to 4 pages, and at the end of 3 months, he would have a book. And so you'll notice that all his books, if you go and look at the books, are pretty much the same way. This is just a great way to create something if you can discipline yourself to do it. If you were trying to save money toward your eventual retirement, if you save only $5 a day at the end of 40 years at 6% compound interest, which of course nobody can get these days, but at the end of that period of time you would have $305,000. Now, by the way, I say you can't get that kind of interest. You can't get it in a bank, but if you invest in things like mutual funds, you can get that kind of return. In fact, it's not uncommon for some of the mutual funds to pull in more than 6%, some of them as high as 20 and 30%. And all of these actions can create a domino effect in the pursuit of your goals. When Jack Canfield and Mark Victor Hansen wrote the Chicken Soup book, the very first one, they decided that they wanted to hit 1 million sales with that book. And in order to do that, they followed the Rule of 5, and every day they would do things like call radio shows, talk shows at 3 a.m. They sent review copies to people. They put copies in bookshops. They got an address book for celebrities and sent book copies to celebrities, and so on. And they had one actor called them and told them he'd like to meet with them, and told them that the producer of his program or his movie, whatever it was, had bought copies for every member of the staff and was inviting them to read them because they were uplifting, and when things were a little bit rough on the set, this could be drawn on to help. Chicken Soup, at the time when Jack wrote the book, it had sold about 8 million copies and had been translated into 39 languages. I'm sure it's considerably higher than that now. The entire Chicken Soup series has sold over 100 million copies at this point in time. So needless to say, that it took them nearly 1.5 to 2 years to do all these things, but clearly it has paid off for them. Okay, so the Rule of 5, that's the first principle, and for each of these principles that I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm not going to have to spend an awful lot of time on them because It is simply up to you to do them. And what I would like to have you do is just consider each of these to be an assignment for this following week, where you start trying to find 3 to 5 things every day that you can do to move toward some important goal to yourself. So the next one is to exceed expectations. And so the question to ask yourself is, do you consistently over-deliver on your promises? It's a characteristic of high achievers. And it is the opposite of what a lot of people do. As you know, there are a lot of people who consistently under-deliver on what they promise. They don't do as much as they say they will, and they disappoint people instead of pleasing them. When I worked with Alan Mulally while he was still at Boeing Commercial Aviation, writing the book Working Together, one of his principles was that if you would just do 10%, do everything 10% better than everyone else, you would be successful. And I believe he's true. That's it, just 10% better, because most people just work to get by. Dr. Peter Drucker said many years ago in one of his books that the job of a manager is actually to get better than minimum acceptable performance from employees, because the minimum acceptable performance level is survival level. And you don't want a business to just survive. You want it to grow and develop over time. And so we as managers need to try to get our people to go beyond the minimum acceptable level. As a matter of fact, there's a principle in neuro-linguistic programming that says the most disrespectful thing I can do to or against another person is to expect less of them than they're capable of doing. And in other words, the most respectful thing, to turn it around, is to expect of someone else that they do absolutely the best they can. And I told the group this week in the class that when I was a child, my father was a very hypercritical individual, and that always came across in a very negative way to me. And it occurred to me one time that I could reframe that. This was only a few years ago. It occurred to me that I could reframe that by realizing that what my father was really doing was saying, I won't accept anything from you but the best you can do. Now, that may not have been his motive, and it doesn't really matter, because as long as I can look at it that way, it relieves me of any feeling of anger or hurt about how he behaved. I'm reminded of the song of The Boy Named Sue, which Johnny Cash made a hit from. And for those of you that may or may not remember the song, this boy grew up being named Sue and being picked on by everybody, and of course they would taunt him and he would fight back. And when he finally met his father and confronted him, his father said, well, son, he said, I know you were a little skinny fellow, and if I didn't do something, you were going to be really bad off in this world, and so I named you Sue, knowing that you'd be forced to take care of yourself, and it paid off. Now, I don't particularly condone that method, but I think in my experience with people, it has worked for a lot of people, because I've met many, many individuals who had very critical parents when they were young and have actually excelled because they were trying to prove to their parents that they were capable, competent, etc. As a matter of fact, I once read an article about Paul Simon, the songwriter, the singer, whose father was a bass player in a little band in New York, and Paul said that all of his career up to that point had been trying to prove himself to his father. And of course, I don't think anybody hardly has ever heard of Paul Simon's father, but there's a heck of a lot of people that know Paul. And I had an academic friend at the University of Wisconsin who also was a high achiever because his father had been somewhat critical. So there might be something to be said for it, although I don't advocate that you go around criticizing your children just to try to make them turn out that way. I think you can do it in a positive way as well. A few examples of exceeding expectations. I read an article years ago about a man who arrived at a hotel, and realized he had forgotten his socks. Now, this fellow happened to be an IBM employee, and there was a point in time years ago when IBM expected their people to wear black socks. And so he needed some black socks, and he asked a hotel employee where he could get some, and the fellow said, well, there's a shopping center not far away, but it would be easier for me just to go get them for you if you don't mind, because it's harder to tell you how to get there. It's not really easy than it would be for me just to go and get them, and he did. And I would guess that that fellow was very loyal to that hotel because of it. I read about a Nordstrom clerk who a man came in and bought some shirts, and he needed them right away, but he couldn't come back the next day and pick them up, and they were going to have to do something about them, monogram them or something. And so this clerk delivered them to the fellow in his time off. So those are things that exceed the expectations of customers. And if you can ask how to do this yourself, go the extra mile, you're more likely to receive raises, promotions, benefits. And if you happen to be in an organization that's going through a reduction in force, a RIF, you're more likely to survive than the people that just do enough to get by, because you're going to be much more valued by your boss and your company than some of those folks will be. If you're in business for yourself, you're going to make more money and attract more loyal customers. Little example of this, when I used to go to Madison, Wisconsin to teach, there was a Japanese restaurant right down the street that I dearly loved, and it was called the Tonton, and the fellow who ran it was a Japanese fellow who went by the Americanized name of Kenny. And when I went up there, I'd be there for 3 days, and I would usually eat 2 out of 3 nights in that restaurant because I loved their food. And every night when I came in, I would order my food and a drink, and Kenny would come over with a little bottle of sake and sit down and have a little tiny demitasse type cup of sake with me. And needless to say, I would have been going in there more often if I'd lived up there. So going the extra mile, you're going to stand out from all the other people who do what you do or things comparable to what you do. And so if you do it for pure reasons as opposed to just get noticed, I think you'll find that it's sort of like giving anonymously. It pays back dividends very quickly. So ask yourself, what can you do to go that extra mile and give more value to your boss, more service to your clients, more value to your students if you're a teacher? How can you do everything you do just 10% better than the next person? How can you contribute something that was not asked of you that will help your organization perform better? It's an interesting thing. We developed a seminar probably 25 years ago on how to work more effectively with your boss. And I'm afraid the seminar bombed because bosses have to approve people to come to these seminars, and they were a little suspicious of our motives, I think. But our whole intention was to help people learn how to be more valued by their bosses by giving them better service, by doing things, as we say, above and beyond the call of duty. So can you refer your boss to some helpful article? Can you tell them about a book that they might enjoy, or a YouTube video that you found that might help solve some organizational problem? It doesn't have to be anything super duper large. It can just be something simple that would be useful. So that's the next principle. Now, this next one, keeping score for success, is something that I've become very intrigued by, because I mentioned to you in one of the previous sessions that there is a strong tendency now to go to gaming techniques to improve workplace performance, classroom performance, and so on, because people love to keep score. They love to evaluate themselves in some way. They like to take surveys and assessments and find out how they stack up against other people. Or, as we've talked about with people who have been injured and are trying to recover, they quit making comparisons to other people, and what they do is they compare themselves today to what they did previously. So if they're trying to recover the motion in an arm, for example, if they can move it just a few degrees more today than they did yesterday, that's a sign of progress. Now, some of you may have, when you were small, may have had parents who drew a mark on a wall somewhere, and had you stand up against the wall, they drew a mark on the wall to show how tall you were, and then they would periodically measure you and draw a new line so that you could see that you were progressing. And some of those parents may have said, if you want to grow up to be big and strong, you have to eat healthy and all that sort of thing. So this was a way of actually encouraging healthy eating and eating properly and all that sort of thing. So you may have gotten started with this very, very young. Now, batters in baseball, of course, keep track of their batting average. They track football players' performance, how many passes have been completed, and so on. So sports are certainly an example of keeping score on a regular basis. But the game-playing people love these games because they get immediate feedback telling how well they've done. And the millennial generation has grown up with that. So if any of you are of that generation, you've been used to getting this immediate feedback showing you whether or not you're progressing. And it turns out that the scorekeeping is an indication of becoming a master of whatever you're doing. It's not just the numbers themselves that are important. It's the indication of progress that's what's important. So it turns out that most successful people keep score of progress, keep records, and also records of positive behavior, financial gain, anything that they want more of, they start measuring. Edwards Deming in quality control used to say, what is measured gets done in an organization. And so the actual scorekeeping started with the advent of statistical quality control and was used in manufacturing, but it has not been used widely spread throughout an organization to any degree. So this is a trend that I think you're going to see more of, because there's a book called The Game of Work by Charles Kunrat that says scorekeeping stimulates us to create more of the positive outcomes we're keeping track of. And he has taught companies how to do this with some of their processes and found very, very significant increases in performance, figures like 35% improvement in performance and so on. So it's worth trying at the personal level as well. Okay, our next technique is called completing the past. When I was in my coaching program in California some years ago, this was a program that met 4 days a month. 4 days a quarter, so 16 classes in a one-year period of time. And one of the sessions that James Flaherty had was on narcissistic wounding. And narcissistic wounding is something that takes place to all of us. There's not a human being alive that hasn't suffered from narcissistic wounding. And it simply amounts to the fact that when you're a little infant, you're totally helpless. And so you've messed up your diaper, you're laying there wet and uncomfortable, and you start crying, and it seems like, I guess to a child, we don't know this for sure, but I expect from our own personal experience, it seems to a child like it sometimes took forever for their parents to come and take care of them. And so they grow up with an immediate experience of the world being one of those very hostile places where, you can be uncomfortable for long periods of time, hungry and wet and all that sort of thing, and nothing happens. So we all have some narcissistic wounding. Then as we get a little bit older, we get punished in some way for something we do, and so we get another kind of a wound, a hurt or something. And of course the Freudian theory used to be that we all suffer these little traumas, and these are the things that screw us up for the rest of our lives, and then we have to spend the rest of our life trying to get over them. Well, Freudian therapy, of course, has been demonstrated to be terribly ineffective because of that, and there are other techniques that seem to be much more effective, such as some of the NLP techniques. But in any case, the message is that these hurts can stay with us for a long time, and some of them are remembered, and we think about them and we feel angry, we feel hurt, we feel that they were unjust, etc. And if you have very many of those things, you may be holding yourself back because the energy that you expend in anger and resentment and all that sort of thing makes it difficult for you to move through positive activities. And so if you can release these things, you can advance faster and succeed more easily. And there's a technique for helping unload these things called the total truth process. And so let's take a look at how you can do that. If there was someone in your past that wounded you and you know who that person was, you can either verbally confront them or do it in writing. If the person who hurt you is living and you want to confront them, you should ask permission before you begin. Now, there are people that just absolutely cannot deal with confrontation. In the Enneagram system, a person who is a 9-point tends to avoid confrontation, and so if you're dealing with someone who's a 9 on the Enneagram scale, they're very likely going to say, I don't want to deal with that, you know. And so if they don't give you permission, then you can do it in writing, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But if they are willing to talk, I would suggest that before you have a conversation with them, that you read the book Crucial Conversations. And I don't remember the names of all the authors, but if you go to Amazon and look for Crucial Conversations, there's about 4 or 5 authors of the book, and I know one of them is named Carrie, and so you'll find the book without any problem. And read the book and find out how to go about confronting someone in a way that is not likely to provoke a big negative response from them. Now, there's no guarantee that you won't get a negative response, but the book offers some really good suggestions for how to deal with them if they do occur. And they have a website that has a number of videos showing examples of how to deal with these things. So if any of you are interested in it, they give you the website address in the book, and you can go there and view these things free of charge. So there's a sequence that you go through to deal with these things, and the first step is to begin by actually expressing your anger. Not just beating up on the person, but just telling the person, you know, this is what happened and this is how I felt about it. It made me very angry, etc. I'm going to show you how these work in just a moment. And then move through each of the following 5 stages that are listed on the next slide here, down through the final stage of love, compassion, and forgiveness. You should spend about the same amount of time on each stage, and here are the stages. And there are 2 suggestions under each of these about how to begin. And if you go to chapter 29 of Jack Canfield's Success Principles book, there are usually about 4 starters for you. So if you need some suggestions on how to start the process, you can get them from the book. But these are examples. So you express anger and resentment first. I'm angry that this happened. I'm angry that you did this. I resent that you made me feel this way, whatever it is. Then you move to step 2. It hurt me when this happened, or I feel hurt that you didn't seem to care about me, whatever. Fear, I was afraid that you might abandon me, or I get afraid of you when you yell at me. Some children experience the fear that when their parents, that they may not only abandon the child but split up, and then they don't know what will happen to them. So they get a lot of fear from any kind of squabbles they hear from their parents and so on. Next, you move to remorse and regret. Now, you could be saying, I'm sorry that I might have done something, and you might ask forgiveness for something that you feel you did, because if you can realize that you may have contributed something to the situation, that can help you as well. Next, you move to wants. And the typical want is to say, all I ever wanted was to know that you cared about me, or I deserve to be understood, etc. And then finally, love, compassion, and forgiveness. I love you for this, I forgive you for that, and so on. Okay, so that's the 6-step process. Now, if we go further and assume that we can't sit down face to face with the person, we can always write all this stuff in a letter. And you can write a letter that talks about all these things, whether the person will participate with you or if they happen to have passed on. If the person won't participate with you, you can write the letter and then destroy it, or if they've passed away, you can do the same thing. But if they won't do a face-to-face, you can still do a letter and actually give it to the person. And sometimes people are more comfortable with written stuff than they are face-to-face, so you can always invite the other individual to write a response to you. And you can use this then to begin a continuing exchange, which hopefully will develop into a verbal dialogue, so that you can talk more openly about all the hurt feelings and so on. Do remember Steve Covey's principle that we should seek first to be, that should say seek first to understand and then to be understood. I should have proofed this more carefully. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. Okay. I read about a very interesting thing that one of the American Indian tribes used to do to get rid of hurts, and that was to dig a hole in the ground, and they would stand over the hole and shout into the hole and tell all the troubles to the hole, and then fill it back in. In other words, they would bury those hurts, and that was their way of getting rid of them. Now, there is a Gestalt technique, which if you prefer to do this verbally and the person won't talk to you, you sit down with a chair facing you, another chair facing you, and imagine that the person is actually sitting in the chair, and you tell them all the stuff that you would have told them if they were there face to face. And believe it or not, this can be just as effective as if they were there, and I'll tell you why. Brain researchers have found that if they put electrodes on your scalp or do an MRI scan while you're thinking about something, they can see the traces in your brain, and they then find that when you imagine the same thing, those same areas light up exactly the same way. In other words, the same circuits, if you want to call them that, are being activated in your brain, whether you're doing the real thing or whether you're imagining doing it. And that's why if you start remembering an event that happened in the past, you will start feeling the very same thing that you felt when it occurred, because you're activating the same circuits and the same responses. So an imaginary dialogue with someone in which you tell them how you felt about what happened and unload that stuff can be as effective as if you were sitting down doing a face-to-face dialogue. And, you know, that's a tremendously positive thing if you think about it, because it says that you don't have to go through the unpleasantness of a face-to-face confrontation if that's one of those things that you have a deep fear of doing. So I would strongly commend these techniques to you. Now, the last step in this process is to forgive and move on. I've told you in the past how stress creates toxic chemicals in your brain, and these go into your bloodstream and they attach to the cells in your body, and if they stay attached to them long enough, they kill the cell. And if very many cells die, then eventually it does damage to your body, which can, over a long period of time, lead to disease and ultimately death. So it's literally true that stress can kill. Well, anger and resentment and the desire for revenge also create those same kind of toxins. Anger itself is a negative stress on your psyche and your body. And so all of these can do the very same thing that long-term stress can do. There's a book somewhere called You Can't Afford the Luxury of a Negative Thought, and certainly not the luxury of long-term anger and resentment. So you owe it to yourself. Even if you don't owe it to someone else, you owe it to yourself to get rid of those things. And forgiveness is the best approach to doing that. So notice that in terms of what we typically call the law of attraction, if you keep on experiencing more and more of the same thing that you dwell on, then you're going to go through life attracting more of the same thing to you. So if you harbor resentment, anger, and so on, and express that a lot, you're going to just keep attracting more and more of it into your life and never escape it. So you need to learn to forgive as best you can. It ain't easy. It's not easy at all. And so one of the things that I'm going to do is, again, come back to an NLP technique that we introduced some time back that I did this week in the class that I was teaching, and got to see people going through this firsthand, and it was wonderful. You remember I gave you this technique to help change an unpleasant memory so that it doesn't bother you anymore. So if something happened that hurt you really badly and you want to get rid of the hurt, this technique can help you do that. And you'll remember the steps are that you watch a movie of the problem situation. So you go back in your memory and you remember the incident, and what you'll find is that you start experiencing the feelings that you did then. The hurt, the anger, the resentment, the desire to strike back, etc. Whatever occurred to you back then, you'll experience again, because you'll activate those same pathways in your brain. Now, you select some theme music that's upbeat. I told you that a lot of people find the William Tell Overture, the theme to the Lone Ranger, to be stimulating. There are others. Sound of Music used to have some themes in it that people found very uplifting, or you may find spiritual music or religious music to be uplifting. Whatever gives you a feeling of peace and excitement, a joy, whatever it may be, select that theme music, and then repeat that movie in your head with the music playing, so to speak. And then check the results by going back to the memory without the music and see if the feeling is still there. In the class I taught this week, I had people do this, and I was out front so I could watch their faces, and since there were only 7 of them, it was very easy for me to watch. And it was almost comical, because when they went through the process and then they checked results, meaning that they tried to remember those same things that had previously hurt them, several of them actually burst out laughing, or at least smiled, because what they found was the original memory seemed almost comical at that point in time. The process worked so well that it no longer evoked the anger and resentment that it had previously done. And this took 5 minutes. 5 minutes. This is the first time in the history of humankind that we've had a process that is that effective, that you can do all by yourself. You don't need a therapist, and it works. So try this with a number of memories, not just 1 or 2 things, but think about times when you may have been embarrassed, hurt, or upset in some way. Practice until you can run the movie without feeling the same thing you originally felt. In addition, we have what are called submodalities. Things that are really strong often seem brighter in our head when we imagine them. They may seem larger, closer, etc. You may hear sounds when you remember them, and so on. things that no longer bother us often appear dimmer, further away, smaller, etc. So when you do these kinds of things, deliberately try to find out what your submodalities are for things that no longer bother you, and try to make the images smaller, dimmer, further away if that's the way the submodalities work for you. So if you put all these things together, you have a group of methods that will be very effective for you. Okay, so these are going to keep you busy for a while. So here are the assignments for this week. And by the way, please don't tune out, because I have another assignment that's going to actually be an instruction for you at the same time. First, let's just look at the basic assignments. Make a list for each day of the week of 5 things that you can do to move toward one of your goals or a couple of your goals. And practice the forgiveness method for someone that's hurt you. The other one on the far left over there, make exceeding expectations a part of every facet of your life, and begin that tomorrow or today, whatever it takes, but start practicing this. Now, I've added a note on the far right that I happened to think of later today after I had already set up the notes, so you can add this one to your list. If you haven't read the book by Tim Ferriss called The 4-Hour Work Week, it has recently been updated. He's added about 100 pages to the book. And one of the things that I want to tell you about in the book that you should look at seriously is the 80-20 principle. Some of you know it as the Pareto principle, but a fellow by the name of V. Pareto, I can't pronounce his first name, and I don't have it in front of me, so I won't even try. But this guy was an Italian economist and kind of a social student of social studies, and he came up with this idea that 80% of the results we get come from 20% of the things we do. In business, 80% of the business comes from 20% of the customers. In terms of errors, which is what was important in quality control, 80% of the defects we see come from 20% of causes. Now, a fellow named Cook, K-O-C-H, and I think his first name was Richard, but I can't remember for sure, wrote a book about the 80-20 principle some years ago, and he talked about using the 80-20 principle at the individual level. And Tim Ferriss has a really good treatment of the 80-20 principle in his book. So either of those two books will get you going, but Tim Ferriss has some really good stuff in his book, so that's why I'm recommending it, particularly for those of you aiming towards success. And what Tim said was that to get down to working 4 hours a week, he found that 80% of what he was doing didn't produce any kind of results, and so he did his best to eliminate those things and was able to do it. Now, some of you are working in regular jobs, and you'll have some trouble doing this because our society is geared to an 8-hour workday, and as most of you know, a lot of that time is total waste because we're in meetings that run on ad nauseum and don't accomplish anything, and we're doing busy work, and I'm going to be candid, we're wasting a huge amount of time checking email every 2 seconds because we've got a notification turned on that, oh, somebody just sent me an email, let me see who that is. And this creates an intermittent schedule of reinforcement that makes it almost impossible to ignore that stupid thing when that notification comes on. And so Tim quit answering email except twice a day. He checks it at 11 o'clock and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I commend this to you highly. It is a huge drain on productivity, your personal productivity, when you check email every time that thing bongs. And you'll find that if you can just bunch them together and do them all at one time, it works much better. I doubt seriously anybody out there is going to die because they don't hear from you in 2 nanoseconds. I grew up in an age when we didn't even have voicemail because we had rotary phones and then dial tone phones, and voicemail came along probably in the 60s or 70s maybe, and before that we didn't have any of that stuff. So if somebody called you and you weren't there, tough, they didn't get you, and they were used to it, so it didn't bother them. And if it was truly a life or death situation, they sent somebody to find you. State Highway Patrol, for example, if there had been an accident or something. So Tim talks about getting rid of the time robbers, the time wasters. So he's got some real good stuff on being more effective. And here's the kicker. I can't remember for sure if we talked about this in an early session, but there's a big difference between effectiveness and efficiency. Peter Drucker used to say it doesn't make any sense to dig the world's best hole if you didn't need a hole. And concentrating on doing the best, most efficient hole digging is ridiculous if you don't need the hole. And so effectiveness is doing the right things, and efficiency is doing those things right. And so it's extremely important that if you want to be a success in life, that you be doing effective things well. And so you must concentrate on effectiveness first, and then you can concentrate on efficiency. So I'll leave you with that thought. I urge you to get that book. It is available both in a hard copy as well as in a Kindle edition. So if you have a Kindle reader or if you have a Kindle app on your iPad or your Droid device, you can read it there. And again, thank you for the letters or emails telling how much you appreciate the course. That means a lot. And I won't be here next week, but I will the following week, and then we'll record the last session and put that online. Oh, and incidentally, I screwed up this week about Lesson 8 because I uploaded it to YouTube. I created a page on the Success site and embedded it on that page, and then forgot to activate the page until today. So it is on the website. A week late. I apologize for that for those of you that may have been trying to find it, or if you know someone who was, but it is up now and available for you to review. We have a few minutes for questions if anybody has one, so I'll be glad to take those. So just type it into the question box and I'll see what I can do to answer any of them. And by the way, I'll make a comment while I am waiting. Those of you who are on tonight are on here consistently. I can look at this list and I almost have it memorized. And I am convinced that you will make this stuff work. So thank you for being here. Thanks for the comments. And since I'm not seeing any questions, I'm going to pull the plug and I'm going to go watch The Big Bang Theory. Thanks a lot. Good evening. Have a good weekend. Take care of yourselves.